The Russia-Ukraine war is very rapidly entering its most decisive phase. The simple fact of the matter is that June is the traditional campaigning season in Russia and Ukraine. Let's not forget, Napoleon invaded in June, so did Hitler invade Russia in June. And that is because the winter is the worst campaign for campaigning in Russia, heavy snow, and then in the spring comes mud, major slush and mud, which totally hampers any tank operations off the road axes. All advances have to be confined to road axes, which are easily predictable, easily known, and can easily be countered. As such, when Russia started this war last year in February, 24th February, it was the worst meteorological window to start operations. But we are given to understand that Russia had little choice because of the simple fact that they were anticipating that Ukraine would attack in Donbass and that would put them on the defensive. So they wanted to preempt the Ukrainian offensive in Donbass, which had been fully backed by NATO and was likely to create a very unpleasant situation for the Russians. So they decided to preempt, and as such they had little choice. Even this attack was delayed because of last minute efforts at peacemaking by France and by Germany, etc. And even the Americans had come forth with proposals. But in the end, nothing worked out. Major NATO exercises had been conducted in Ukraine along with the Ukrainian forces, and for all members, Ukraine, for all practical purposes, Ukraine was a member state of NATO already. This was not something the Russians could stomach, and they were forced to attack. There was definitely a clear underestimate of Ukrainian military capabilities and will to resist. The Russian intelligence seems to have, tripped up badly on this aspect, and as such, the Russians, at least President Putin, seemed to be convinced that it would be a repeat of Georgia 2008 or Ukraine and Crimea 2014, in which very little had been done. In fact, had Russia launched this full-scale invasion in 2014, it would have gone like a knife through butter. But from 2014 onwards, the Americans and the NATO went out of their way to build up the Ukrainian armed forces, to train them and to prepare them for the coming offensive. They have been saying so openly that they made full use of the Munich peace agreement, so-called peace treaty, to try and prepare Ukraine for the war ahead. Russia attacked with just 150,000 men. Now, this was, a very, very dangerously low manpower level for Russia to undertake such a major offensive. There was no question at all of Russia trying to even think of capturing the whole of Ukraine. That was never their intention. Their intentions were basically to secure the area in Donbass, that is the Luhansk and the Donetsk province, as also secure the land bridge to Crimea and to secure the southern coast and capture all of Ukraine's major ports to cut Ukraine off from the sea. So that was their minimal terrain objectives, for which they thought 150,000 troops would suffice, because they had terrific technological superiority, military equipment superiority over the Ukrainians. The unfortunate fact is that this level of technological superiority was not adequate for the Russians to even secure their minimal objectives. The Ukrainians had 250,000 men in arms to start with. They had mobilized completely. This had shot up by the time the war started to about 450,000 men, and some estimates now even put it to about 600 to 750,000 men in arms, out of which about 450,000 are well armed, well trained kind of this thing. The unfortunate thing for the Russians was that their initial underestimate of Ukrainian capabilities was to prove very, very costly to the Russians. And the Russians, therefore, had to, give up their operations towards Kyiv and Kharkiv. They claimed subsequently that these were primarily deception operations. That does not seem to be quite the fact, because of the simple fact that 4 Russian corps, that is Combined Arms Army, CAAs, were used to attack Kyiv and Kharkiv. In fact, there were 5 of them which were deployed in this sector. So such a huge force level committal cannot be just for deception. The aim was initially to at least to invest Kyiv, if not capture Kyiv, and hopefully they had hoped that there would be an internal uprising. The Russian intelligence seems to have gone badly off the mark in this, and they had misjudged their capabilities to arouse some kind of a rebellion in Kyiv. This did not happen. Kyiv was extremely well defended, and the Russians, since the Russian advances were confined primarily to the roads, they could not go cross country. There were heavy forested areas where the Ukrainians were able to ambush these tank columns using their javelin and the other anti-tank guided missiles supplied by the United States and NATO, which they said were war-winning factors, but they were not really war-winning factors, but they did slow down and cause significant attrition on the advancing Russian columns, which were entirely road-bound because of the weather constraints. So the Russians were smart enough to realize that their offensive on Kyiv had failed to, make the breakthrough that they desired, and therefore they were able to pull their forces out of Kyiv and from Kharkiv and redeploy them to try and capture Donbass. There was very heavy fighting in the campaign season in the Donbass. They were able to capture almost the whole of Luhansk and about almost 60% of Donetsk. But especially the battles of Sverdonetsk, Lysychansk were heavy, very heavy battles of attrition in which the Russians used their artillery to very significant effect in trying to pound their way through, almost like the campaigns which were reminiscent of what had happened at the close of World War I and the close of World War II. The fighting in Ukraine had turned into an artillery war, and the Russians are said to have fired between 30 to 60,000 rounds per day to try and flatten this place. The Russians then focused on Bakhmut. The Ukrainians put 5 brigades out to Bakhmut, which was the biggest concentration area. But by this time, the Russian invasion force of 150,000 was overstretched over 1,200 kilometers of a border. They had made very good progress in securing the land bridge to Crimea and securing most of the ports, less Odessa, of the Ukrainians, which curtailed the Ukrainian GDP by 35 to 40%. And even the port of Odessa was blockaded by the Russians. By this time, the Ukrainians had been given a fair amount of weapons and equipment by the United States and by the NATO countries, and with the help of this they were able to raise almost a fresh corps, with the help of which they attacked in the south towards across the Dnieper river, and they were able to make a fairly successful but though a slow advance down there. And then the Russians pulled out troops from the Kharkiv sector to reinforce this sector. They were constantly having to juggle their troops from one segment of the border to another segment of the front line because they were terribly short of manpower. and this cost them very heavily, because when they denuded the Kharkiv sector, the American satellite-based intelligence, AWACS, their drones, they were able to inform the Ukrainians of the gaps in the Russian defenses, and the Ukrainians took full advantage of the total gap in the Russian defenses in Kharkiv to launch a very swift offensive which hit the thin air, because the Russians were at that time withdrawing to the river line in the rear. And this created a lot of embarrassment for the Russians, and the Russians then had no choice but to mobilize. Putin was trying to avoid mobilization because that would was politically, it would have costs in terms of resentment in the population, and the second was that Putin had called it a limited operation, limited operation, and he did not want to enlarge the scope, but he had no option by that time, and therefore in September the Russians were forced to mobilize. Their mobilization speed was fairly impressive. They mobilized 300,000 reservists, and now a fresh batch of conscripts, about 145,000, have also been recruited. These are being intensively trained, and it is expected that around end May, beginning June, when the campaign season starts, when the ground hardens, the Russians will launch their major counter-offensive with about almost upwards of 200,000 forces, 200 to 300,000 forces. And the second factor is the Russians have mobilized fully as far as arms production is concerned, and they are able to, despite all assertions to the contrary, the Russians are being able to churn out the requisite amount of artillery ammunition. Artillery, medium artillery, 155 millimeter caliber and above, is the decisive war winning factor in this conflict, as it was at the end of World War II, as it was at the end of World War I, when major battles of attrition had been fought. The advantage lies with the defender. The only way to pound the defender into submission is by using very heavy artillery bombardments of up to 30,000 to 60,000 rounds a day to flatten the objective. The Russians seem to be concentrating right now on absolutely decimating Bakhmut, because they feel that this is the largest single concentration of Ukrainian troops is here, and they have been able to get them to fight a grinding battle of attrition, and they hope to destroy the largest number of Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians are supposed to have suffered very heavy casualties in the battles of Bakhmut. They have come up to the river line. The Russians came up to the river line, which more or less bisects Bakhmut into half. Now they are across the river, and they claim to have captured about 90% of Bakhmut. Now, it was thought that the Ukrainians would, give battle and then withdraw. But Zelensky seems to have decided that he would fight to last man, last round in Bakhmut. He has tried to restore Bakhmut. There were even talk of launching a counter-offensive in Bakhmut to stall the Russian offensive. But as per the reports coming, the ratio of casualties between the Russians and the Ukrainians at one time had reached 10:1. There were 10 Ukrainians dying for every single Russian because of the heavy use of artillery firepower, and then now it is supposed to be 7:1, but the Ukrainians can't sustain it for very long. That's number one. The manpower losses, because Russia has also now mobilized and Ukraine is desperate. There is news that armed Ukrainian gangs are going up and picking youth as young as 16 from the streets to throw them into the battles of Bakhmut. Once Bakhmut falls, the Russians will likely have a clear run to, the Kramatorsk and the lines in the rear, and they could even try and break through to the Dnieper river and thereby bisect Ukraine along the banks of the Dnieper, which is a formidable river obstacle, and it would give them a border which is very easy to defend because it is based on a major river obstacle. The Ukrainians are also been talking in terms of launching a counter-offensive, and they say that they have been getting tanks, about 15 odd, German tanks, then the Leopard tanks. They also claim that by June, July, or by next year they'll get some Abraham Russian tanks, 15 to 20, similar numbers of Challengers and some French tanks, etc. So this mixed assortment of tanks will still not be adequate to try to sort of tilt the scales in the battle with the Russians. Because don't forget, the Russians have got over 1,300, 1,400 T-72, T-90 tanks. They are also bringing in their T-80s from their old war stocks, T-54, T-55s. So they have no dearth of equipment. Their problem was manpower, which they have redressed, which they have corrected, and about 80,000 of these people were thrown to stabilize Russian defense lines, which were falling very short of manpower. And now Russia has been very methodically training its reserves. As it is, they are military reservists who have already done service, so it should not take very long to train them up to good fever pitch. But the Russians are not taking chances now. They are planning very methodically to go in the campaign season when the ground hardens, and they can carry tank maneuver off the road axis, which makes the offensive far easier than it would be now, with their advances confined to just the metal tarmac roads, which are easily predictable, which can easily be, you can inflict heavy attrition using various means. The Americans have supplied them the HIMARS, which were fairly effective initially in attacking Russian concentrations, in attacking Russian, ammunition dumps and headquarters, and thereby delaying the pace of operations. But now the Russians seems to have caught up with how to deal with the HIMARS. So we are expecting the major Russian counter-offensive to go in most probably with this June, and with that would be the end game. The NATO has been saying that they are not in a position to keep supplying Ukraine with artillery ammunition at the hectic pace at which it is being used up. The NATO military industrial complex is not up to the mark. The Russian military industrial complex has been fully geared up, has been fully mobilized, and now they don't seem to be short of either missiles. They were having problems with the electronic chips. It is believed that China has stepped in to provide them electronic chips for their missiles. The Russians have taken a lot of these Shahid Iranian drones, which may not be very accurate, but they have been retrofitted with the Russian GLONASS GPS system, so which has increased their accuracy by many orders of magnitude. Now these are kamikaze drones, and these are being largely used to mask the Russian missile attacks by their cruise missiles and also their hypersonic missiles and their tactical ballistic missiles, which are being used on a very, very large scale. They have been hitting Kyiv and the other major towns repeatedly to try and destroy the electrical power infrastructure, which would affect the railway trains, which are on electrical power based supply. So when you damage the electrical power grid, you create problems for the railway transportation network. Ukraine is short of oil, Ukraine is short of gas, and therefore it may not be possible for them to run trains at the same level on diesel, because they are short of diesel. They are in fact buying Russian oil through third, fourth country sources, it is said. So if the entire crux of the battle, which will erupt in May, June, probably this year, would be the deciding factor would be the supply of artillery ammunition. The Russians have managed to shore up their artillery rounds production. They have huge stockpiles from the Cold War period lying down waste. They are trying to buy up weapons even from Egypt, because there the shelf life of that ammunition is getting over, and it would be to the Russians' advantage and also to the advantage of the Egyptians to sell them this thing. There are reports, unconfirmed as yet, that North Korea and China may supply ammunition to the Russians, but I don't think the Russians really need that ammunition. What they really need is their electronic chips. So that is where the battle stands as far as kinetic operations go. We expect major kinetic operations to commence in June, and if that is the time that the ammunition supply of artillery to the Ukrainians will start faltering, then this could be end game. We may be looking for end game in Ukraine, and then Ukraine would have no option but to negotiate on terms which are highly unfavorable now. So far, the United States and NATO had not forced Ukraine not to negotiate and to adopt maximalist positions that they would drive every single Russian soldier out of Crimea, out of Donbass and all Ukrainian territory. I think that was highly unrealistic. The Americans seem to be bent upon fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. The amount of damage that Ukrainian cities and infrastructure has suffered is catastrophic. Like I said, Ukraine has lost about 40 to 45% of its GDP because all its ports, less Odessa, have been captured by the Russians. Mariupol and as it is Sevastopol was already with the Russians, and therefore the Ukrainian economy will be very hard hit. There is a limit to how much this economy can be shored up by United States and NATO beyond a point. You find that there is a lot of economic and political upheaval in Europe itself because of the cost and pressure of the war. It is my contention that the primary aim of the United States in forcing this conflict, in more or less forcing the Russians to attack, leaving them no option but to go in for an offensive, was to force Russia into a war where they would impose economic sanctions, and they had hoped that these economic sanctions would force the Russians to collapse, could possibly cause the pain of the sanctions, could cause a regime change in Moscow, as had happened in the 1990-91, when the erstwhile Soviet Union had collapsed because of economic overstretch, imperial overstretch, economic collapse. The whole of the Soviet Union had collapsed in a matter of a few years. But then let us not forget, one of the contributory factor to that was the oil glut engineered by the United States by putting pressure on Saudi Arabia to flood the world with cheap oil, and which caused the price of oil to collapse from $30 to almost $10 a barrel, which is what it was in the 1930s. And this oil glut had collapsed the Soviet economy. And this time the relations between Saudi Arabia and the United States are very, very fraught. The Saudi Arabians have, they have refused to be kowtow to the Americans any longer, to follow their diktats and to sort of, lower the price of oil as the Americans had demanded. They are not prepared to torpedo their own economy to get down the economy of Russia. The Chinese have in the meantime brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the other Gulf kingdoms to have peace in the Middle East. The United States rapidly seems to be losing ground. The United States economy has suffered, but it is the European economy which has been hit hard. Rather than a regime change in Moscow, what we are finding is that the so-called our democratic governments in London, in France, in Paris and in Germany, they are under severe pressure from their own people because of the economic hardship. The stoppage of cheap Russian oil and gas to Europe has been economically very, very devastating for Europe. But it appears that America couldn't care less for devastation in Europe. And now there is the Pentagon papers which have been leaked seem to show that the Americans have been eavesdropping on their friends in South Korea and in other places in Europe too, and Japan, etc., where they have, and the estimates that have come out from the leaked Pentagon papers seem to indicate that the level of Russian casualties is far lower, the level of Ukrainian casualties is far higher than was estimated. You see, at one point the Pentagon was talking of 100,000 casualties each, killed and wounded on both sides. But now they have brought it down to 17,000 and 37,000. So, which is not really adequate to stop Russia in its tracks, but very definitely the Ukraine cannot afford this bloodletting for longer. 5 million to 6 million of their people have already fled abroad. The manpower that was available in Ukraine has all been more or less exhausted. They are now trying to pick young boys off the roads and just draft them and send them to the battlefield. They are short of ammunition, and 15, 20, 30 tanks are not adequate. They have been asking for F-16s. It is questionable how effective the F-16s will be if piloted by Ukrainian pilots. That is the key. If piloted by Ukrainian pilots, the Ukrainian pilots are more, their muscle memory is more used to flying MiG-29, Su-27, Su-24. So even if they are given F-16s, it will take them long time to train and get used to them, and they may not turn out to be very good F-16 pilots. So therefore they have also been asking for more of MiG-29s, etc., but they are getting them in very small driblets. And in any case, the air defenses of the Russians and the Ukrainians have proved to be very strong. The Russian Air Force has been quite conspicuous by its absence from the skies so far. The number of sorties they have been able to launch is 250 to 300 per day at peak periods. It's much less in the normal time. Whereas don't forget that in the Gulf War I, the number of sorties per day launched by Americans and NATO was 1,600 per day. In the Yugoslavia war, it was 600 per day. Even India had been able to generate sortie rates of 450 to 460 sorties per day in 1971 war. So one of the main constraints in this war is that the lethality of air defenses, S-300 missiles, S-400 missiles, has gone up exponentially, and that has kept both the air forces, even the Russian Air Force, which is far superior, they have also been conserving casualties. They have been launching standoff attacks largely, and they have been relying more and more on missile strikes and drone strikes. Drones, Shahid drones, to mask the missile attacks. They have been launching large-scale attacks on these on the city targets, the civilian infrastructure, in a bid to destroy the power grid, the water grid in Ukraine. So, as to summarize, all that one would say is the main battleground in this Russia-Ukraine conflict was, even more than the kinetic battles, was the economic war. The Russians seem to have countered the sanctions extremely adroitly. They, increased interest rate to 20%. They forced all transactions for oil and gas to be paid in rubles, and that by itself was the war-winning factor as far as the economic war is concerned. The price of the ruble had fallen from 80 rubles to a dollar to almost 160 rubles to a dollar. Then it was back up to 60 rubles to a dollar. It was the best performing currency in the whole world against the dollar. And now it's again gone up to 80 rubles to a dollar, which was the pre-war status of the ruble. But the Russians seem to have countered the sanctions in very deftly, and because China and India have stepped in to buy Russian oil and gas, which is much cheaper and economically far more beneficial to us. We've gone in for them. Even Europe, for that matter, has been buying Russian oil and gas on the sly, and most of the war has been funded by European purchases of Russian gas and oil. So the economic sanctions have failed miserably. They have caused a hell of a lot of economic pain in Europe. You can see the ongoing strikes in France, in UK, in Germany. The regimes there are under pressure because the war against Ukraine is proving to be the heaviest cost is being borne by Europe. And even America has not got unscathed. If de-dollarization takes place, the American economy will take a big hit. We are seeing the initial signs in terms of, anti-inflationary measures are leading to the collapse of a number of the American banks. So how far that stretches, how far that goes, only time alone will tell. But economically, the American hope of destroying the Russian economy by their sanctions has not materialized at all. Russia has countered those sanctions in a very, very efficient manner, and the bulk of the pain has been inflicted on Europe. How long Europe is going to politically accept this pain remains to be seen. There was a lot of talk that in this winter the prices of petrol would go through the roof, and the bitter cold would cause severe problems in the European nation states. Fortunately for the Europeans, the winter did not prove to be so severe. So that is the situation as of now. To make that forecast, I expect the months of June, July, May, June, July, depending on when the Russians, the ground hardens adequately, when the Russians decide to launch their counteroffensive, what happens when Ukraine also launches its very highly advertised counteroffensives. I'm not very sure how successful they will be, but the Russian offensive is going to be a major one with at least 200,000 to 300,000 troops involved. They could make a breakthrough to the Dnieper River. They are on the brink of a breakthrough in Bakhmut sector, and that means the whole of Donbass would then be in the Russian kitty, which is their minimal objectives would have been obtained. And any hopes of a ceasefire, whether under Chinese mediation, whether under Indian mediation, as the G20, we can only think of this only somewhere around August, and September is the time when we should really, when both sides have shot their bolt, they have launched their offensive, and they are now aware of the outcome of their offensives. Only then will the two sides be amenable to a ceasefire and to peace talks. So I think that is the window that India should strive for, as the presidentship of the G20 is with India, presidentship of the SCO is also with India. India is uniquely positioned now to try and make a difference. But right now, if we try, it would be premature, because the battle is still open. The outcome of the kinetic war is still open. Outcome of the economic war, though is more clear, but still not decisively concluded. So the best time to go in for peace initiatives would be August, after June-July offensive. Both sides have shot their bolt and have reached a kind of a stasis on the battlefield. Only then would be the time be opportune for any ceasefire negotiations. Anything before that is premature. As we have seen, the Chinese initiative has not really worked. Even in the United States, the leaks which are coming out are indicative of the fact that they are now trying to prepare very subtly the American public for peace talks in Ukraine, because the kind of bloodletting they have forced on the Ukrainians cannot continue for on and on. It is extremely unfair to the people of Ukraine, to the nation of Ukraine, which has been devastated in this war, and any any American design to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian standing is quite immoral. Immoral because the kind of economic expenditure that will be entailed in, reconstruction of Ukraine, of its destroyed cities, would be running into trillions of dollars. So who is going to fund it and for how long remains to be seen. How long will Europe, the people of Europe, suffer at the cost of Ukraine? How much sacrifices they are prepared to make? So far the Ukrainian attempt was to try and show them some hope that Ukraine could win the war. I think these are turning out to be highly unrealistic expectations, and everything now hinges on the long anticipated Russian offensive in June this year. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I think endgame in Ukraine will come in June, July, August this year. Endgame is likely to come, especially if the Russian counteroffensive proves decisive, especially if the economic pressure proves decisive on Europe, and the artillery ammunition battle for production will tilt the scales in Ukraine.